Namaskar students. Today we'll be going into the English series of lectures, lecture number 7. As I spoke to you last time of the post-Cold War and the great issues, today we'll go into what are the main ideas of thinking that come in with the post-Cold War period. This is very important for us to know what are the main ideas that came out of this period. So today we will be going into these ideas and how was the Cold War seen and how are we looking at the global era, the 30-year period after the demise of the Soviet Union or the breakup of the former Soviet Union into Russia today. We can also call it the post-Soviet order. In international relations thinking, all of us believe that it is a paradigm shift. Paradigm as used by Thomas Kuhn, whom I'll be discussing when we'll be doing methodology. And Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift is when totally a major event makes a huge shift in the way we have been thinking about international relations. Many scholars and I as well believe that this was indeed a period where a tectonic shift took place in international relations with the breakup of the former Soviet Union. So the unexpected collapse of the communist project, something that filled the entire Cold War with a fear that here was the Red Peril. The whole international politics of the Western world was built on the fear of this project. If you see any of your James Bond films or anything, it's all like the fear of the communist or the Red Peril. It felt like a house of cards. So if you see, there are many writings. One is, whom I'll be discussing, is Francis Fukuyama. His book, On the End of History and the Last Man, he argues that with the ascendancy of Western liberal democracy, which occurred after the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that humanity has reached the end of history, the end point of an ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So he says, liberalism has finally triumphed. The second book that becomes extremely important for us is The Clash of Civilizations and a New World Order, a hypothesis presented by Samuel P. Huntington. And he says that the Cold War was based on political and economic ideologies. But the post-Cold War or the post-Soviet order will be on people's cultural and religious identities, and that will be the primary source of conflict. It will not be fought on any political ideologies, but between cultures. Right? And then I'm also going to touch upon two other important thinkers, Slavoj Zizek and Kenneth Waltz. Right? So let us go into these four thinkers and what were their ideas. They're very seminal ideas, and it is extremely important for any student of international relations to know these ideas of how they looked upon this huge paradigm shift that took place in 1989-1990. That is the demise of the bipolar world, the breakup of the former Soviet Union, and how did they see this break. So first, Francis Fukuyama. Yoshihiro Francis Fukuyama is an American political scientist, and he wrote this book, The End of History and the Last Man, 1992, which argued that the spread of liberal democracies and free market capitalism of the West and its lifestyle may signal the end point of humanity's socio-cultural evolution and become the final form of human government, saying that communism has lost out to liberalism and liberalism has won the day. However, in his subsequent book, Trust, Social Virtues and the Creation of Prosperity, he has modified to acknowledge culture cannot be cleanly separated from economics. Now let's go into what was his end of history project. See, the end of history is a political and a philosophical concept that supposes that a particular political, economic or social system may develop that the world would constitute the end point of humanity's socio-cultural evolution. Fukuyama's argument was that the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union, the last ideological alternative to liberalism, had been eliminated. Fascism had been killed off in the Second World War, and now communism was imploding. In states like China that called themselves communist, political and economic reforms were heading in the direction of a liberal order. In fact, not political, at least economics is capitalism. The Communist Party is the largest multinational corporation in the world. What a paradox. And Fukuyama basically based his rationale on Hegel. And he basically believed that the state had become absolutely victorious. Most of you must have read Hegel. Hegel called the state the Geist, the spirit that walks, the form of divinity that walks on earth is the state. So he personified the state as one of the perfect and the most victorious forms. Now with communism vanquished, they said with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the communist project is lost. And the major powers converging on a single political and economic model, Hegel's prediction had finally been fulfilled. This could be common marketization of international relations, and he thought that the world, the liberal order, had the last word. See, events in Asia were not what Fukuyama thought. If you see in China, the Tiananmen Square massacre takes place in 1989, and most of you know that, really speaking, it was not the triumph of the liberal order. The communist state was still looming very large. So if you see, to a very large extent, China and even Russia under Putin has come back, has really liberal democracies become victorious. So many people believe that whatever Fukuyama said was very Eurocentric, and it has nothing much to do with Asia, Africa, or even Latin America. So let us now look at the assumption, which is astonishingly, how would you put this whole movement of fitting, as I told you, Vladimir Putin into his whole project. Vladimir Putin is very much there. Russia is very much a major power, a space power, a nuclear power, and it does have its say in West Asia, what in America you call the Middle East, all this. So many people believe that this is extremely simplistic, like the Black Lives Matter movement now. So Hegel thought that the end of history would arrive when humans achieved a perfect self-knowledge and self-mastery. So this whole end of history debate comes in from the Hegelian thought, when life was rational and transparent. Rationality and transparency are the values of classical liberalism. Rationality are supposed to be what make free markets and democratic elections work. People understand now the system's functions and allow them to make rational choices. So the question is, in the Hegelian sense, has really such things happened? So the first idea that comes in with the post-Cold War and the way of interpreting it was of that of Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama looks at this from the liberal and the neocon lenses and declares victory to the West. Many people believe quite prematurely, and to liberalism. The second thinker, who is much more pragmatic, is Samuel P. Huntington, a brilliant political scientist, has done a lot of work in comparative politics and other areas on political order and others. He spent a half century at Harvard University, where he was the director of Harvard Center for International Affairs and a professor. His Clash of Civilizations is a thesis of people's cultural and religious identities. And he says this is going to be the primary source of conflict, because you are now replacing political ideologies and economic ideologies, which was the main source of rift, with religious and cultural identities. He says that this is though controversial, there have been many people, but to a large extent, some of the events that have taken place do keep us warned on this dystopian-like clash between major world ideologies. He says that the world is full of rife, both internal and external conflicts. The clash of civilizations and the remaking of a world order is an expansion of a 1993 Foreign Affairs article written by Samuel Huntington that hypothesized on the new post-Cold War world order. Now, what does he say? He says, prior to the end of the Cold War, societies were divided by ideological differences, such as struggle between democracy and communism, between a centralized economy and a free market. Huntington's main thesis is the most important distinctions among people are no longer ideological, political, or economic. No. Now they're going to be cultural, of who you are. New patterns of conflict will occur along the boundaries of different cultures, and patterns of cohesion will be found within the cultural boundaries. He refutes all past paradigms. To begin his argument, Huntington says that it is ineffective to talk about earlier paradigms because the reality of the global political order is very different. In his words, he says we need a map that both portrays reality and simplifies reality in a way that best serves our purposes. Huntington develops a new civilization paradigm to create a new understanding of the post-Cold War world. And he wants to fill up the gaps of the already existing paradigms. Now, to begin with, what does he do? He divides the entire world into 8 major civilizations. First, he says the scenic civilization, which is the common culture of China and Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. Second, Japanese culture as distinctively different from the rest of Asia. Hindu, identified as the core Indian civilization. Islamic, originating on the Arab Peninsula, spread across North Africa, Iberian Peninsula and Central Asia. Arabic, Turkic, Persian and Malay are among the distinct subdivisions within Islam. Orthodox, that is Orthodox Christianity, centered in Russia, separated from Western Christendom. Western, centered in Europe and North America. Latin American, Central and South American countries with a past of corporatist authoritarian culture. Majority of the countries are of Catholic majority. Africa, while the continent lacks a Pan-African identity, Huntington claims that Africans are also increasingly developing a sense of an African identity. Shifting balance. See, Huntington starts this section by arguing that Western power, and its influence is fading. See, a major important thing that he brings in is this whole issue of universality of values versus uniqueness of values. He says, yes, the West wanted to make its values universal, but it did not become. Even Bernard Lewis says that what went wrong, especially with the Islamic civilization. They don't accept most of Western ideas of democracy, secularism, or separation of the state from the church. For them, everything is one and the same. So the question is, he says this whole West may have unique ideas, but are not universal ideas. And on one side, he says the West's hold on power is also to a large extent declining. It has a monopoly on technological research and development, military strength, and economic consumption. But relative influence of Western countries is declining. Huntington adopts the latter view and describes three characteristics of the Western decline. What are the three characteristics he tells you and me? He says the current Western decline is a very slow process and is not immediate threat to world powers today. The decline is slow, but it will take time. Second, decline of power does not occur in a straight line. It may reverse, speed up, or pause. So he says this progression is not going to be a straight line. It can go front, backwards, or anything, or even stop for some time. And he says the power of a state is controlled and influenced by the behavior and decisions of those holding power. Now, religion and world politics. Huntington asserts that there is an increased role and importance of religion in world politics. Religion is the societal factor that filled the vacuum created by the loss of political ideology. This is one idea, please keep it, because you have a Marxist like Zizek more or less saying this about the Islamic world. So just keep this in mind. That the vacuum created by the loss of a political ideology usually is taken up by religion. Major religions around the world experience new surges in commitment, relevance, and practice by erstwhile causal believers. Huntington goes on to say that replacing politics with religion was also the result of increased communication among societies and cultures. So he says this technology, information and communications technology, has increased, has hastened this process. People need new sources of identity, new forms of stable community, and basically religion provides these meaning and purpose initially very well. He says there is a resurgence, especially in Muslim societies, unlike Asian societies, have asserted cultural identity to reaffirmation and resurgence of religion. Very fact symbols of religion, people wearing nowadays you see more people are wearing veils and burqas than you did earlier. For example, the Mopla Muslims in Kerala never dressed the way Arabic Muslims dress. But today, because of movement, communication, transportation, they are now very much aping. Or even Tamil Muslims. See the way A.R. Rahman's daughter is dressed. You can't see anything of hers except the black cloak. And this is an Arabic way of dressing. It was never the Tamil way. Tamil Muslims did it at least 15 or 20 years back. Or the same thing you can see in Southeast Asia. There is an Arabization. Huntington argues that the resurgence of Islam embodies the acceptance of modernity, rejection of Western culture, and the recommitment to Islam as a guide to life in the modern world. Religion is the primary factor that distinguishes Muslim politics and society from other countries. He says they become more Islamic of the. Huntington also argues the failures of state economies, the large young population, and the authoritarian style of governance has contributed to the resurgence Islam means. That means he says the lack of political development, whatever the reasons, when you do Zizek again talks about this in Islamic societies. So the resurgence, he says, is because of this. Clashes. Huntington predicts and describes great clashes will occur among civilizations. He identifies 8 of them. First, what does he do? First, he anticipates a coalition or cooperation between Islamic and Cynic cultures to work against a common enemy, the West. You see Pakistan, Iran and China. We may not like what he's saying, but things are moving that way. Iran has preferred China to India. And Pakistan, you have a lot of Islamic countries that are hand in glove with China. 3 issues that separate the West and the rest are identified by Huntington as the West's ability to maintain military superiority to the non-proliferation of emerging powers. Second, he says, the promotion of Western political values such as human rights and democracy. This has been a major discussion in international relations on Asian values. China says that Asians do not see human rights as like the universal human rights, and it's very different from in Asia, which is not true because India accepts universal human rights. Then you have this restriction of non-Western immigrants and refugees into Western societies. So Huntington basically says that the conflict between Islam and the West to be a small fault line war, and the conflict between America and China having the potential of an intercivilizational war of 4 states. You can see recently each of them closing down their consulates. America in Houston accusing China of stealing intellectual property rights, and China in retaliation closing then the Chengdu consulate of the United States of America. Now the fault lines, if you want to understand, as Huntington calls them, he says that what are the fault lines? What types of fault lines can there be? First thing he says is communal faults, conflicts between states or groups from different civilizations. 2, almost always between people of different religions. Prolonged duration, and this is going to take quite a long. Violent in nature. Identity wars, us versus them, eventually breaks down to religious identity, like we had the Delhi riots. Encouraged and financed by diaspora communities, like we saw in the Shaheen Bagh listing. Violence rarely ends permanently. Propensity for peace is increased with third-party intervention. Now he says it's the West and the rest. He says external challenges including emerging cultural identities in the non-Western world. Internal challenges include the erosion of principal values, morals and beliefs within the Western culture. He also contributes to the debate between multiculturalists and monoculturalists, and states that a multicultural world is unavoidable because global empire is impossible. He says everybody has to accept a diversity. You cannot have uniformity. The preservation of the United States and the West requires a renewal of the Western identity. The ability for the West to remain a global political power, it needs to adapt to increasing power and influence of different civilizations. Without adapting, the West is destined to decline in power and influence. The West clashing with another civilization is the greatest threat to the world peace and to an international order. He wants that as well. Now, with Samuel Huntington there's quite a lot of criticism. People say no, civilizations can coexist, but from time and time we have been seeing terrorism uses religion as an identity these days. Now we are going into the Marxist reply, and one of the most brilliant philosophers and most exciting, according to me, is Slavoj Zizek. He's a Slovenian-born political philosopher and a cultural critic. He was criticized. He was described by the British literary theorist Terry Eagleton as the most formidably brilliant recent theorist to have emerged from continental Europe. I find his writings, his ideas, absolutely mind-blowing. Please, if you do have time, do read some of his books. He has written a lot. If he can be breathtakingly perceptive, he can also be outrageously irresponsible. Can he really be serious when he claims in The Trouble in Paradise? This is a book you must read. It's very, very interesting. He says the worst of Stalinism is better than the best of the liberal capitalist welfare state. Or is he just out to scandalize the suburbs? He has made the statement, and it is extremely important to make us all thinking, because the inequalities that come in with a liberal capitalist state can greatly be more troublesome than of even Stalinism. Now, global capitalism. In Trouble in Paradise, Slavoj Žižek, one of our most famous, most combative philosophers, explains how by drawing on the ideas of communism, we can find a way out of the crisis of capitalism. There is obviously trouble in the global capitalist paradise. That is the trouble. But why do we find it so difficult to imagine a way out of the crisis we are in? It is as if the trouble feeds on itself. The march of capitalism has become inexorable, the only game in town. Setting out to diagnose the condition of global capitalism, the ideological constraints we are faced with in our daily lives, and the bleak future promised by the system, Žižek explores the possibilities and the trance of new emancipatory struggles. Now, in this book, he sees the world divided between liberal capitalism and fundamentalism. That's why I said, please remember when I'm talking about Samuel Huntington. Here again, Žižek tells you the fight is between liberal capitalism today in the post-Cold War world and fundamentalism. In other words, between those who believe too little and those who believe too much. Instead of taking sides, however, he stresses the secret complicity between the two camps. He says fundamentalism is the ugly creed of those who feel washed up and humiliated by a West that has too often ridden roughshod over their interests. He says the Islamic world, whenever it had a successful socialist governance, you had the United States of America, CIA during the Cold War, doing a coup and removing them. For example, you had Pan-Arabism. You had the Ba'ath Party. You had President Nasser in Egypt, or in Syria you had Assad, or you had Saddam Hussein in Iraq, or Muammar Gaddafi. All of them were removed by the West. Or even in Iran, when you had the 1953 elections, many people say US rigged the elections to see that a truly democratic movement lost the election. So you have Žižek who says one lesson of the Egyptian revolt, Žižek argues in The Trouble in Paradise, is that if moderate liberal forces continue to ignore the radical left, they will generate an unsurmountable fundamentalist wave. He says now, wherever you have had these socialist progressive governments, you have toppled them. When you topple them, the answer is they go to the other extreme and become religious fundamentalists. Toppling tyrants, which all good liberals applaud, is simply a prelude to the hard work of radical social transformation, without which fundamentalism will return. You have to support, even if he's a dictator, if he is making a social transformation. See, most of the people who say that under Saddam Hussein, Assad and Muammar Gaddafi, minorities were safe. Maybe they were treated as second-class citizens. They were not exterminated, killed, raped, murdered, and made into sex slaves, which you have now under with these fundamentalists. So Zizek is telling you, you cannot intervene. In a world everywhere under the heel of capital, only radical politics can retrieve what is worth saving in the liberal legacy. So in Trouble in Paradise, he says the rise of Islamofascism, Zizek points out, went hand in hand with the disappearing of the secular left in Muslim countries, a disappearance the West itself did much to promote. This is a major accusation he has done, and which is very true. Who now recalls that 40 years ago, Afghanistan was a strong secular state with a powerful communist party which took power there independently of the Soviet Union. Every emergence of fascism, Walter Benjamin wrote, bears witness to a failed revolution. In the Muslim world, the West has played a major role in stamping out such movements, creating a political vacuum into which fundamentalism was then able to move. There is also a lot of writing by Edward Said and his group saying that the word jihad was never used in Muslim writings until the CIA invented it in the 1980s. It is extremely important for all of us to think about it. It cannot now feign ignorance of its predatory past in the face of an Islamist backlash it has helped to unleash. So Zizek says it is these free Western countries which supported fundamentalists, fanatics, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the creator of Osama bin Laden. At one time Reagan called him a great freedom fighter. So he says you cannot forget all this. Those who are reluctant to criticize liberal democracy, Zizek suggests, should also keep quiet about fundamentalism. He says end of history to the end of history. When it comes to content, however, nothing could be further from postmodern pluralism that Zizek's uncompromising revolutionary politics directs. It's a strange sign of the times that perhaps the most popular intellectual in the world is a dedicated communist. The lesson of Trouble in Paradise, subtitled as the end of history to the end of capitalism, is plain. What does he want to tell us in this? He wants to tell us a new dark age is looming, with ethnic and religious passions exploding. That's why I said he and Samuel Huntington are more or less on the same trend, and Enlightenment values are receiving. Zizek's style is notable for its hard-boiled refusal to be emotionally intense, another postmodern feature. But even he can scarcely contain his disgust at the vision of thieving bankers being subsidized by their ruined victims. As Brecht inquired, what's robbing a bank compared to founding one? So these are the paradoxes he's bringing in. So Zizek is one brilliant thinker, which I would recommend most of you to read, and especially his book called Trouble in Paradise. And if you want to understand how to look at a framework that you can have for the post-Cold War world, he is one. And now last I would go into the father of neorealism, Kenneth Waltz. Kenneth Waltz always pleaded for the stability of a bipolar world. He discussed in details the theory that the bipolar world is the most stable arrangement of international relations, based on two hegemonies, American and Soviet equilibrium. He said the structure itself, not in the interest of national states, determines the extent of the whole world state's for foreign politics. Kenneth Waltz, as most of you know, is the father of neorealism. He says the significant difference between classical realism, which places emphasis on human and domestic factors, neorealism emphasizes how the structure of the international system determines the behavior. So he says that bipolarity was very stable. And as long as bipolarity was there, you didn't have uncontrollable events taking place. Neoclass, so if you see very clearly, he says the breakup of the Soviet Union was not good. He thinks that that breakup will bring in a lot of issues for us in the post-Cold War world. He was right. He says stable bipolarity. Why is bipolarity stable? According to what? The bipolarity is more profitable form of the balance of power, as it limits the possibilities for qualitative revision of the status quo by actor states. Meaning, with the number of actors being very less, too many people cannot come and shake the system, and there are not too many decision makers. The whole world space is divided between two centers and its satellites. And even local changes become unlikely, as automatically it revolves into the conflict of two super states that are able to destroy each other, as well as the whole of humanity with direct nuclear collision. So he thinks that this is a very stable system because the number of decision makers are also limited. The Cold War ended for many reasons, but few predicted it. And it may not have ended without Mikhail Gorbachev. So now what is it that you can predict for the future? The United States and the unipolar movement. The end of the Cold War, followed by the collapse of the USSR, dramatically increased the weight of USA in the international system. In 2000, the popular view was that USA was more a hyperpower, not a superpower. What is a hyperpower? Is a state that dominates all other states in every domain, military, culture, economy, and is considered to be a step higher than a superpower. The term refers to the United States due to the status of the world's only current superpower. However, its possible status above that remains a topic of dispute, because today, economy-wise, America is not such a great power. Culture also, there's a question mark. Military, maybe yes, but then there is still Russia, which does have its military power. So the question that many people say is, you can call it hegemony, not a unipolar moment. But this has brought in, this transition has brought in several, possibilities in international relations. So hegemony under Clinton, there was a great focus on economic issues, using US economic power to reinforce its position in the international system. Sanctions against Iran, Iraq and all that. The debacle in Somalia in 1993 and done nothing to prevent the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. They were active in the enlargement of NATO and imposed its military solution on the Serbs in the unfolding war in former Yugoslavia. No grand strategy and lost the will to fight. Joseph Nye says the only superpower cannot go alone. It needs allies. Like you have in the Indo-Pacific. Recently, the Americans formed a Quad. You know the Quad, Indo-Pacific, India, Australia. You have basically Japan and the United States of America. The paradox between the magnitude of American power and Washington's inability to use the power to always get what it wants in international politics. United States looks very powerful. It has all the things, but it has not been able to get what it wants, especially with dealing with China, dealing with Hong Kong, other things. It needs others to come together. So many people today say hegemony is not omnipotence. So the whole post-Cold War period, if you see, to a large extent, by all these four thinkers have been very, very interesting. One, Francis Fukuyama, the second, Samuel Huntington, the third, Zizek, and fourth, Kenneth Waltz. So it is extremely important for us as international relations students and as those who love the subject, that we should know that the post-Cold War world, there are different views that have come in from very eminent thinkers of international relations. They view some of them, and it is extremely important that we read some of these books because they make extremely original comments, and many of it to a large extent may be true. So in the next lecture, I will continue into this new world order, but from ideas, I will move to the praxis, right? Or theories to the praxis. Thank you.